first I want to say, I would like to congratulate you on your first novel. Secondly, I want to ask you, since in many ways you're a bridge between India and France, both through the work that you've done there in many fields. You've lived in France for 20 years, you've been in Geneva, you've been in Italy, you've become, in a sense, a person who belongs both to Europe, to France, and of course to India. Who are you actually?
I was trying to find that. I was trying to discover, to make comparisons and look at the differences. So that was, what led me there. Who am I? I think I'm an amalgamation of all these things. I think one starts out at one point and ends up somewhere totally different, very far away, but one never loses sight or touch with one's origins. So you carry those with you and you keep on building layer upon layer of personality, of instinct, of appreciation, of knowledge. So as you go along, you just pick up more and more baggage, and then that's what defines you ultimately.
In making this kind of contrast between two cultures, one quote-unquote cliche Oriental, the other Occidental, I notice very often that you outline, as part of the narrative, a certain opaqueness in the understanding of one culture for the other. It shows in Robert's assessment, in spite of the passion he shares with Kranti, and Kranti's assessment of many things in Paris. It shows in your descriptions of India and the contrasts you make with the sometimes excessively antiseptic life of France. Is there a clash of cultures?
No, there isn't a clash of cultures. I don't think one can talk of a clash of cultures. I sometimes think of these two cultures as ships passing each other in the night. And there is a lack sometimes of genuine communication and genuine understanding. There is a fascination, certainly, but neither of us, except of course for various notable exceptions and wonderful people who understand France as much as they understand India and vice versa, they don't seem to go beyond the facade. That fascination just remains there, which is why I always say that in France there is an image gap about India, and it's the same thing in India about France. Most people think of France in terms of cliches. We are really, in India, not interested in what is driving French society, and there are many things which are very similar to India that's driving French society. For instance, we just had municipal elections in France, and you've had several major towns which have been conquered by the extreme right anti-immigrant Front National. Now, how is that very different from the Shiv Sena here? Or how is that very different from the kind of divisive politics we are looking at today, where the finger is being pointed at the other, and the other is being made to feel like an outsider, although he is genuinely part of the fabric of society.
There is one thing in terms of a knowledge gap, but it's worth exploring. I think your very powerful novel deals with it, and as all novels should do, leaves it with the reader to sort out. But there is genuinely a scenario where cultures, even when they are united by much more knowledge about each other, and much more which is common between each other, including McDonald's or CNN. And yet there is a residual opacity in terms of comprehension. May I share a small anecdote with you? In my book, Becoming Indian, the unfinished revolution of culture and identity, I examined this, and it's a very small anecdote. It's about an Indian bureaucrat, a lady who's in Paris on work, and it's Karwa Chauth, the day when women fast for their husbands. and she needs to see the moon. She's been fasting the whole day. She needs to see the moon before she can eat. And she's very hungry. And she goes up in the hotel where she used to see the moon faster. She goes right up to the terrace, which is apparently a prohibited zone. In doing so, she trips an alarm. Within seconds, there's the security staff. She doesn't know French. The security staff doesn't know English. She points to the moon and says, I have to see it. They think she's going to commit suicide. She says, it's for my husband. They ask, where is he? She said, in India. They ask her why. She said, because for his well-being. Why? Because I must fast. Anyway, she lands up in the police station. And the Indian embassy had to be called to interpret and so on and so forth. Now, cultures can be different. And what seems easily comprehensible or almost a reflex in one becomes in the other completely strange, unfamiliar territory. Did you find that? And I want to ask you personally, as you negotiate this territory for the first time as a novelist, your own duality, have you internalized it? Are you a victim? Are you enriched by it, or have you transcended it?
I am not a victim in any sense of the term, and never have been. Have I internalized it to an extent? Do I find it there? Yes, I do. For instance, many people in the West are mystified and horrified by the whole notion of a woman in India who is not a village person, who's not uneducated, who's not, somebody who comes, quote unquote, from the lower orders and who's willing to have an arranged marriage. For them, that is something so utterly strange. Because for the French, love is everything. And they say, how is it possible that somebody who's been to college, been to university, etc. And that is one point beyond which I cannot seem to be able to penetrate. There is a curtain that comes down, and they say, no, sorry, this is something we don't buy. We cannot understand this mindset. So there are issues where, you can't go beyond a certain point because there is a deep cultural conditioning that goes into it, and these are extremely deeply held beliefs that you cannot shake, and you cannot get other people to at least try and see things your way. At least try and put themselves in your shoes and understand culturally where, people from your country are coming from and where they might want to go. So up to a point, yes, I belong to both cultures. I remain fundamentally and essentially Indian. But of course, I can also find myself at ease in various strata of French society. So it works on many different levels.
This difference of culture that you talk about, why I'm laboring this point a little, because when reading your novel, the interplay between India and France through the characters seems almost seamless. There is a seamless flow from one to the other. But just to take off from what you said, and I want to ask this point pointedly, is when this difference is there, and certain barriers you can't penetrate, it can lead to respect from a distance, it can lead to indifference, or it can lead even to contempt. Have you gone through all of this as a person who's an immigrant?
I think very early on, yes, it can lead to distance. It can, I think, lead to contempt. And I have detected contempt in a lot of social envy. Especially now that you have France going through a deep economic crisis, and there are a lot of people who seem to say that, foreigners have it really good because all these diplomats, and look at the way they live, and all these foreign journalists who are cruising around in their cars and, living really well. So there is that kind of jealousy and social envy that is creeping in. But very early on, I decided that I was not going to be an immigrant. and that I was going to let the French know that I straddled two cultures, that as somebody who'd been colonized, I'd learned a great deal about their culture. And I knew much more about their culture than they knew about mine. But I knew a great deal about my own culture as well. So every time I spoke to them, I sort of subconsciously placed them at a disadvantage. And the French are very conscious about, intellectual achievements. They love the intellectual. They like anybody who they think has read Derrida and Foucault and Camus and all these people. So if you had the right kind of cultural references, the respect levels for you went up dramatically. And I made sure that they got to know that I had them.
So it wasn't an effort.
It was an effort, but it was not something where I had to fight contempt and where I felt sorry for myself or anything like that. If at all, I ended up having the upper hand because I always dressed in my mother's gorgeous silk saris, and I more or less presented myself as not as an Indian princess, but something who was equivalent to one, an intellectual princess, if you like, and they loved that.
I love that arrogance of spirit.
You have to defend yourself.
Yeah, and the very fact that you had to take that platform, the 7 notes on the spectrum, that they were different culture. But we'll drop this here because that should emerge more from your book. Would you like to read a passage?
Yes, now I was wondering if I should read a passage that has to do with these cultural differences.
Read it. Also your.
Let me see. Sitting in the hard-back chair of the police station, he was thankful he had not taken Kranti on as a patient again. No, he had said in all honesty, I was not treating Madame de Laurel at the time of her death. I never gave her prescriptions or professional advice, and she never seemed depressed to me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the questioning had come to an end. Politely, even affably, he was told the case was closed. A death certificate was issued, the body released for cremation. Robert Pierre finally understood why and felt the tension leak out of him like air leaving a balloon. He felt like hugging and shaking Olga Savage all at once. That was how his troubles with Sophie had started. That bastard inspector had called her up, just like that, without as much as a by your leave. Sophie. The police were not the only ones who wanted to discuss Sophie. Kranti could hardly contain her curiosity about his wife, his practice, his arrangements at home. What does she do? She'd ask suddenly one day, the question catching him at his most vulnerable, in bed, spent, after a bout of unusually vigorous lovemaking. He'd put his glasses back on before saying simply, she teaches French literature at the Lycée Louis le Grand, and she writes. What does she write? Books. What kind of books? Children's books mainly, but she's just finished her second novel. What does she write as? What do you mean? Does she write as Sophie Perrin? No, he'd given her a sharp look. He felt she knew all the answers already, but wanted to hear him say them, a confession of sorts, under duress. She writes under the name of Dominique Taquet, her twin brother who died in an accident. Does she know you have other relationships? Does she mind? We made a pact 8 years ago to lead separate lives. We agreed there was no longer any sexual attraction between us, so we released each other physically. It's a harmonious relationship. I cannot bear to live alone, and I cannot stomach the thought of moving each time a relationship ends. So this suits both of us fine, and we look out for each other. Of course, I don't like to go about advertising the fact that I'm seeing someone, nor does she. I don't know if she has someone. I hope for her sake she does. How very mature and civilized was Kranti's only remark. He knew from her first mouth that he had touched a very raw nerve. And now he had lost them both, the two women in his life. Once, just once, Sophie had lost her calm. Then she turned on him a couple of days after the police had spoken to her. How can you act so normally as if nothing's happened? You knew her, petted her, had sex with her, and now she's killed herself. Why? Don't you even want to know? There's so much hurt and contempt in her voice. he dared not approach her, and she took refuge behind a wall of icy silence. Perhaps he could still bring Sophie around. Exhaustion overtook him, and Roberti had slumped back on the sofa, closing his eyes. Before long, he was snoring gently. He did not hear Olga Savage tiptoe to the kitchen with the coffee cups, let herself out. An hour later, he was still sleeping peacefully for the first time since Kranti's death. I'm very sorry, I didn't actually read the passage about Inspector Laporte, but I think we should do.
Let me say, source of pain. Looking for the little cranny that will allow closer contact. Now, I think that's very good writing. Vaiju, how autobiographical is this novel?
I knew that question was going to pop up somehow, somewhere. There are a few bits here and there that I've collected from family stories, but actually this novel is really the percolation and the distillation of all my experiences as a field reporter. And I've now had something like 30 years as a field reporter, and very often I find that when you're reporting from the outside, you are publishing about 10% of what the material you collected. Because you interview so many people, you get involved with their lives, you talk to them for hours together, and then you're constrained by that 1,000-word article where you have to get the entire picture out. So you're telling your readers about the framework, where they can place the story, where it's taking place, the physical descriptions of where it's taking place. For instance, I went to Lampedusa when all these African migrants drowned. And when I went to Lampedusa, which is a tiny rocky outcrop, about 20 square kilometers, and you had more than 300 bodies that were being fished and brought ashore, and several hundreds of other people who were being placed in retention centers. So I'd spoken to them, I'd spoken to people who were part of the municipal council managing this affair, and then I spoke to these two brothers. One was called Salvatore, the other was called Giuseppe. One had a fishing boat, and the other one had a refrigerated truck. So the first would fish, get his haul in, and the other one would then go to all the chic hotels on the island to sell the catch. So after this tragedy struck, the first one's boat was requisitioned to fish out the bodies, and the second one's truck was used as a makeshift morgue. And how this thing has affected their lives completely and totally forever. Now the first doesn't go out with his fishing boat anymore because he says, I used to go to places where I knew fish would gather. And now in my nets I'm catching human remains. So I get a thigh or a skull or an arm or something else. And he says the new laws on immigration are such that providing any kind of succor to an illegal immigrant, whether it be body, dead body, or a living person, is illegal. So I just cross myself and I toss these body parts back into the sea. Now how do you get all this into an article of 1,000 words? Explaining the whole context of illegal immigration, where these people come from, what it means, what these leaky boats are, what or her own way. So yes, I am in the middle of the next book because this one is long gone and forgotten.
There's a little question here. It might sound a little mundane, but I just wanted to know, since you live in Paris, how do Indian woman and a French man relate to each other? Which are the points of convergence, and where do they differ exactly? Is it a clash of cultures or convergence?
You want to know exactly?
They relate
I can tell you the point of convergence.
Yeah, Pavan is absolutely right. It also depends on your height and your grade. No, but there isn't. It depends on what kind of worlds you inhabit. If both of you belong to similar worlds, I mean, in India, you can have two people coming from completely different worlds and coming together and discovering totally different things about each other's worlds. And the same is true of any society, howsoever small or large. It depends on where you come from, what your points of view are, what your framework is what your points of reference are. I think those are the defining things. And also that bodily chemistry that brings two people together.
I think one last question.
It is a structured society.
Well, thank you so much. Vaiju, congratulations again. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.